All right. Um, so I'm Parker Callister. I'm a first year PhD student here at the Eastman School of Music. And today for Composition Symposium, we have the great pleasure of having Dr. Martin Bresnick as our guest this week. He is the Charles T. Wilson Professor in the Practice of Composition at the Yale School of Music and is also the director of the New Music Workshop at the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival in the summer. He's taught all over the world at an incredible number of institutions, but most notably at the Eastman School in 2002 and 2003. And there's a lot more that I could say, but I'll keep it brief for now. And we'll touch on some biographical things as we go through the interview, I think, just given the questions that we've received. So Dr. Bresnick, welcome. As you know, we have a list of questions compiled from the composition department. And Charles, do you want to introduce yourself before we begin?
Sure. Hi, I'm Charles. I'm a junior in my undergraduate this year. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this interview. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. So I guess we'll start off with kind of a broad and ambiguous question, and then we can sort of focus in on a few specific pieces and ideas. So first of all, how has teaching composition over the years changed you, and in what ways?
Wow, it's a great. Actually, that's a great question because not every composer likes to teach or is a teacher or has any real feel for it or feels comfortable doing it. But I've been very fortunate in that choice of a vocation, along with my compositional activities. So I've really enjoyed it, and I've been learned a lot from my students. It's a cliche, but it's certainly true. Over the years, meeting a wide range of very, very talented people has kept me on my toes, kept me thinking about things, kept my own compositional practice lively. If I think back to one of my earliest students in composition, that goes back to the time when I was a young teacher at Stanford University after I graduated, was David Lang, who I ended up teaching again later at Yale. And he's a lifelong friend now, but getting to watch his development as a composer and transforming himself from what he was as a 16-year-old kid to the kind of major figure in American music today has been a tremendous delight. I could say that about any number of people in the program, from Kevin Putz, who is also a Eastman person, to Missy Mazzoli and Julie Wolfe, and any number of people whose music has been very stimulating for me to think about. And I don't write like they do, and they don't write like I do, but we mutually have learned to speak each other's languages in a useful, critical way. So we get better, I think, by that contact, and I think that's been true of me. It's been great for me. I sometimes view my long tenure at Yale a little bit like Haydn must have felt about Esterhazy working out there. It's given me this tremendous chance to try things and think about things in an environment that was very supportive for what I was trying to do.
Okay, great. Um, and then, so with the materials that we got from you, there was an essay in there on teaching composition, um, and you emphasize the idea of the sounding result above all else. And then there's a question here that, with that in mind, what advice might you give to a student who is interested in experimental or graphic notation or music that involves indeterminacy, in which the sounding result may not be immediately apparent or reproducible or have a direct correlation to the composer's written work?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain kinds of music that the advice that I gave about sound doesn't really apply very much, and I wouldn't presume to give advice across a place where my it wouldn't be as useful. I mean, one of the lessons of my own activity was that despite my interest in conceptual features in music, conceptual music generally, that for me in the end, if there was if there lacked a significant balance and dialogue between the sonic world that I was trying to create and the conceptual world that was in dialogue with it, if that dialogue didn't exist, if there wasn't some balance of those elements, I would be on the wrong track. So I don't actually know. I mean, I want to be candid, and I don't know that how I would. Composers for whom indeterminacy is a primary interest for them, they live in a world in which the experimental outcome of what they do is as interesting to them, whether it achieves one result or another, and that's appropriate for what they do. It's just not something that I do, and yeah, I'm I guess for me, I think over time, it has become, it seems to be have become more important for me to emphasize the human capacity for music making in its social form and in its circumstance of civilizing us as humans and bringing out our human characteristics. And people like to make music, and they like to make music together. And experimental music and indeterminacy is one significant feature of musical production, but just as significant, and perhaps in my view, even more significant, is the ancient desire to create and share music together, whose outcome we can predict and want to know more about.
So, I guess another question regarding this essay was, in a similar vein, you give a list of examples of students that you've encountered in the past, and this person asks, as student example D, I was wondering if the intention of the music is effective but difficult to play. Should the student compromise to the situation and simplify the ideas and techniques so that it could be performed properly? Or just wait for the opportunity that someone is able to or willing to be able to perform the piece?
So I'm not sure I get you want me to respond to, is that a question is what
I guess they're saying, should the student I guess simplify their the complex idea that they're presenting?
Well, I think what this person is getting at, if I may be wrong, but I'm just going to pursue this a little further. There can be a tendency to suggest that your ideas are so complicated and so important as ideas that even if they can't be realized by a performing musician, you should stick with them and assert them in the face of any resistance, in anticipation that at some point down the line, someone is going to be able to do that and perform that work. And that's okay. I think that's okay, but I also think that experientially, I have found that I need to make my music just as complicated as it has to be, and not one bit more, because if I can make it performable, not necessarily easily, but performable, I find that performers that I work with give back so much to my music. They contribute in a way that is so profound that it makes my music better. It makes my musical thinking better. I understand what I was doing better. That's part of the social process that I was referring to before, in which there's a kind of shared creation of something beautiful or something moving and interesting. And in order to achieve that social sharing, it does seem important to me not to go out of your way to make things unnecessarily difficult. Make them as difficult as they have to be, but not one bit more. And it's not a particularly original thought with me, but simplicity, achieving significant simplicity is perhaps the most difficult thing to do as a composer, or for any artist, to achieve what they want to do and make that known in the simplest and most direct language possible. I mean, there's a great poem by Bertolt Brecht, whose title I actually used and which I sort of quote. The poem is, "And I always thought," and it goes something like this, just a part of it. "And I always thought that the simplest words must be enough. When I say how things are, everyone's heart must be torn to shreds. If you don't stand up, you'll be torn down. Surely you see that." And that's what Brecht had to say about it. And the simplest words. If you can get there, good for you. That's the way I feel about that.
So were there kind of steps along the way as you were developing as a composer where there were instances where you tried to, put a lot of notes on the page that you didn't necessarily need, and then the performers kind of put up a fuss and you had to
Yeah,
sort of.
sure. I mean, I think as young composers, there's always a little anxiety that if you don't present a work that has some visible or immediately apprehendable complexity, you're going to be seen to be, sort of derriere garde rather than avant garde. You're going to be seen to be a person who's not really with it sufficiently or something like that. There's a great deal of conformist self-consciousness, I think, among younger students, which I shared as a young student. I wouldn't deny it. But as you proceed further and you try to figure out what your ends are, what is the point of what you're doing, you may begin to achieve a different kind of balance in relationship to complexity and difficulty, and also you begin to notice that some of the you could write a piece that would be performable by two people on the planet, and that would be fine. You'll always be known as that person who wrote the most difficult piece, a kind of Sarabji world of piano, compositions. That doesn't make those pieces any better than any other pieces. I mean, the simplest Satie piece sometimes trumps the most complicated Sarabji piece in my way of thinking. So the degree of complexity, one way or another, is not really the issue. It's just how complex does it have to be in order to be expressive of what you want to do. And just to conclude that, working with great musicians, as I've had the honor of doing in my life, wow, I mean, they work their tails off, and I respect that. That you can't pay these people enough to do what they do. We're often not as kind to them as we really ought to be, because we can't really, we're not in a field where compensation is really equal to the amount of effort that is expended by these people. So, I mean, I'm just taking a person just off the top, like Ashley Bathgate, my friend, the cellist. I mean, she'll sit there for hours working out some difficult refractory passage, and if you do it right, you'll get back what you invested in it, and with interest. And that's precisely the kind of relationship with musicians that I like to have.
Okay, excellent. And I guess the last question in this sort of vein is this same person was wondering what your perspective is on the style of the music of the future. Will the new music in this sort of experimental style be accepted by more people than it is now?
I mean, I think one of the persistent ideological positions of our era is the concept that music progresses, that there is a music of the future altogether. It's not a concept that I'm very comfortable with, because I think it reflects a kind of unitary directionality in the direction of musical creation, which is just, it doesn't work for me that way. I think music is kind of quantum-like. It goes in every direction all at once, and novelty can be found in every possible direction. So the music of the future, I've never been a great prophet about what that is. I actually don't know, and I've seen a lot of prophets come and go in my time, making all sorts of predictions. I mean, after all, Schoenberg said that, as he put it, the discovery of the 12-tone system would ensure the superiority of German music for the next 100 years. Excuse me? Did that actually happen? Was it really a discovery? And was it the music of the future? Debussy famously said of Wagner that he was who wrote the music of the future, who claimed to write the music of the future. Debussy famously said of him that he was a beautiful sunset mistaken for a dawn. So there you go. I'm kind of with these folks. I prefer to proceed in my own direction, and I let the future take care of itself in that way. You know that's the sort of the way I feel about it.
Yeah, yeah. Personally, I feel like there's more sort of streams of thought in regards to like what classical music is these days now more than ever.
Indeed, and I mean, Yale is the original home of Charles Ives, and if you think about Charles Ives, he's simultaneously one of the most progressive experimental composers that America ever produced, but he's also one of the most old-fashioned and sentimental ones as well. And but what is really striking about Charles Ives is just how Charles Ives he is. What an individual notion he had of what he wanted to do in music. And as a teacher, that's what I really try to encourage in my students. Not that they find their way to the first car of the avant-garde train, but rather that they try to discover it is what they have to say and to find the means in which to say it.
Excellent. So I guess we're going to sort of hone in on a few of the pieces that we all listened to this last week. There's a few comments here on your piano trio. Somebody's asking, could you please tell me what inspired you to compose this piece?
Well, like anything else, there's about a million things and no things. I mean, to sum it up would be probably I couldn't successfully do it, but there is an interesting thing about that piece in terms of inspiration that is unique to that particular piece, and that is namely that I had felt that I had gotten to the end of a certain stylistic type of compositional thing, and I felt that I really wanted to clear the deck and restart my compositional practice like from ground zero with the simplest possible details and see if I could elaborate another way of extending a piece in time that did not necessarily take any previously known stylistic model that I knew about and just start doing that. Start from the beginning and see what I could do. And that's one of the most radical formalist pieces I've ever written is that trio because it required that I retool everything. And yeah, there's very good essays on it that some other students have written, looking way through it and to find all the details of it, and that have to do with symmetry and palindromes and all sorts of other formalist devices that I thought might be brought to bear to make a musical utterance that was not that was either neither dependent completely on the past musical kinds of utterances in an obvious way, but also wasn't part of the conformist, newer trends in music towards, say, post-romanticism or minimalism or complexity. I mean, I just wanted my own language and see if I could find it. So that was an attempt to really, sort of subject my own thinking to a complete overhaul. There's nothing quite like that. It's not quite like that after that.
Another student asks, and maybe I'm a little confused by this question, but maybe you'll know. Was the orchestration an integral part of the composition process, or was it a means to a compositional end?
In the trio, are they referring
Yeah.
to? Oh, well, I mean, I had a commission from the Monticello piano trio, so I knew those were the instruments that I would be dealing with, and I knew something about their history, and I'm a great admirer of the Ives piano trio for one thing, but also Schumann and Schubert and Beethoven and Smetana and any number of other people. So I listened to a lot of piano trios, but I wanted to make the individual parts as vivid and as robust as I could make them. And based on my experience, I thought I did pretty good. I probably went a little overboard with the cello because I lived in a world at Yale with a great cello studio when Aldo Pariso was alive, and I was exposed to cellists who were kind of off the charts, and I think I had a kind of utopian idea of what the cellos could actually do. So the cellists find that piece particularly demanding, um, but the pianists don't get an easy ride either. And the violin is not a walk in the park either. So that is one of the most difficult pieces I've ever written. But also, as part of that was also knowing the orchestration. I mean, I haven't really addressed that so much. Uh, well, I think you can hear it. I mean, this the fast the trio the opening movement has an almost very lyric, expansive character, but the second movement aims to take the pizzicato and short notes of the piano and make us hear them in relationship with strings and piano in that way. And yeah, that's this kind of a teasing out a morphology, a sonic morphology in which all the instruments share with each other. Certainly, the third movement, the exchange between the violin and the cello, in which they sort of melt into each other, was a very intentionally strategic orchestrational thing. I mean, that's always a dialectic. It's always every instrument is really a kind of a filter when you think about it. It can't do everything, and every instrument has its limitations, and your task is to make those limitations into benefits, and to make profit from those limitations, make them sing, make them eloquent somehow. That's how I feel about that.
So with works like this, with multiple movements, but also movements that have distinct characters, how do you connect them? How do you go about kind of making like a cohesive piece out of many different movements like that? How do you connect them? Sort of a
Well,
vague
yeah,
question,
that
but
that is a multi-movement piece, as is most of my well, actually, all of my string quartets have multi movements. But not everything I write is multi-movement. There's many pieces that are just standalone pieces. In the case of the piano trio, there is a paradigm or principle of organization, which, if I revealed it to you, I'd have to kill you. So I don't know if I should do that. But maybe I'll suspend disbelief for the moment and say that the concept of palindrome and symmetry and handedness is a feature of every movement of that trio. In the first movement, it's symmetry around a single pitch, but in the second movement, it's symmetry around an interval, and that principle becomes transformed in the third movement to where it starts functioning around both those potential axes of symmetry, and such that in the third and fourth movement, we almost solve the problem of palindrome and symmetry. But I think one of the yeah, so yeah, in fact, you hear in the final movement a sort of version of the pizzicato movement. It certainly comes back toward the end of that, but in a way that I think empties it out. I mean, I felt personally that the piano trio was as far as that formalist energy could go for me. And thereafter, even though I continued to work with symmetries and palindromes, I was not content to let that be such a pure formal thing anymore. Other things had to happen to satisfy me, and that yeah. So in multi movement works. Let me just add, say, for example, that something that I didn't let you see or hear now that I've just completed in the last couple of years is a fourth string quartet for the Brentano String Quartet. And in that work, there's kind of almost like Schumannian sphinxes, a certain intervallic collection that, even though it some places it's invariant, it'll occur over and over again, but the context is so dissimilar from one movement to another that you quickly forget that that's a unifying feature. You just hear something lyric or exciting or thought provoking, but there's this embedded uh, sphinx, and almost like in Carnival. Um, yeah, that's another multi-movement piece that does something, that a way of organizing itself. I mean, again, at some point I began to feel like any device that was really fertile and useful would do for me to, and I didn't have to depend on a single thing. So, for example, I don't know if I gave you the Caprichos Enfaticos, the work for the soul percussion and Lisa Moore kind of percussion concerto, but based on Goya's paintings. Well, it's a multi-movement work. It's 7 pictures of Goya that go from beginning to end. It's about a 30-something minute piece, and it uses a principle of what you would call in African drumming amadinda, the idea that you can play on both sides of a percussion instrument. So you have people playing on one side of the marimba and the other simultaneously. But it uses that black key, white key opposition and joining as a feature of virtually every single movement, even though it doesn't necessarily make that particularly explicit all the time. So, yeah, that's one way I would unify a multi-movement piece, usually internally rather than externally. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I'm going to turn it over to Charles for the rest of the interview, I guess. So yeah, take it away, Charles.
Sure, thanks. About another piece, could you talk a little more about Grace and how it portrays the ideas in von Kleist's The Puppet Theater? Is the piece like explicitly programmatic with detailed portions representing certain things, or is it more of an abstract thing?
Well, I'm a very I believe in the old Robert Browning quote where he said, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?" And so I try to do everything. I try to do the interior logic and the exterior programmatic thing. So in that, the Puppet Theater, which is a very, very interesting story, and I won't detain you, you should read it on your own. One of the ideas, of course, about marionettes and puppets is that they are suspended, from strings and so there is a kind of a pendular feature to them, and that suggested to me some of the formalist, palindromic, and symmetrical formations that I had been doing in the piano trio. And in fact, it turns out you've just chosen a piece that does very much the same thing. The first movement of Grace is completely symmetrical, around a single oriented pitch, and the second movement, like in the trio, is symmetrical around a dyad, and the third movement then combines the two together. So solves the problem. But the idea was to there's another feature of that piece, I think, which is quite literal, and I'm unashamed about it, in that you have a puppet master and a puppet in that concerto. That is, one of the two marimbas is really great and amazing, and the other one is a little bit more childlike and sort of learning. He always has to follow the master and learn what the master is doing, and very much in the way that the puppet master directs the activity of the puppet. And if you follow that score, you can see that in almost every case, that one of them is a great master and the other one is very good, but not quite at that level. And that is a strategic also decision. I mean, it's not only a decision that reflects, literary figures in the short story of Kleist, but Robert Van Cise, who commissioned that work, told me that he had originally thought I should write a percussion a marimba concerto just for him and orchestra, and he reminded me that there's always a percussionist in the orchestra who never gets to play a concerto, and he's a percussionist out in the back. So why don't I write a piece for two marimbas and get the guy or the woman who's playing in the back of the orchestra playing marimba to come out into the front and play along with Bob. So knowing that not everybody could play at the level of Robert Van Cise, it made sense strategically to have one Robert Van Cise major part and another very good but not quite Robert Van Cise companion part to make the second marimba work. So there's a lot of needles being threaded, I hoped, in that work. A formalist one, a referential one, a strategic one in terms of who gets to play what part.
Yeah, no, that's great. Just some more back to more general questions or questions about your teachers, which you mentioned in your piece. But I was wondering, could you expound more on how certain teachers taught you what not to do, without naming any sensitive names, of course? But I thought that was a really interesting part of.
Oh, you mean the teachers who are not very good teachers who I learned not to do what they did? Is that what you're aiming at? You don't want
Yeah,
to hear good advice from my good teachers. You want to hear. Well, I can only say that I had one teacher for whom any deviation from his particular way of working was a sign that I was a bad student, didn't write good music. I mean, he literally would change my music. He'd bring it in. He'd take his pencil and he'd erase my music. He'd write his own music in, and eventually he looked at this music and he said, "Oh, Bresnick, how dare you bring me this abortion?" He took my music and he threw it on the floor. So I would say that's not a good teaching, tool. I mean, I think that would be not a good idea. And I think I there is the old Zen statement, which is again maybe apocryphal. It may not actually be a Zen statement, but it's worth pondering. In which the phrase goes that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So, I mean, I think that's definitely true. There's a lot of truth in that, and you can learn sometimes interesting things from even bad teachers if you're able to let the bad stuff go and just look for the good stuff. And we all had to do that. I think. I mean, I don't want you to nod your heads now, but I think we've all had to do that at some point. Somebody knows a great deal, and they may not be a very good teacher, but you want to get out from that person what is the pith, the good stuff, and so you tolerate sometimes some bad stuff, and you make a mental note saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do what that teacher does. I'm not going to do that.
yeah, thank you. We do have some questions about other teachers too. One person wrote, "I appreciated your lesson from John Chowning that music is how it sounds. I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about what that means for music as a performance art, where pieces can sound quite different depending on who's playing it, different musicians."
Well, yeah. I mean, this goes back to the earlier question that we had before, doesn't it? I mean, after all, Chowning, my teacher and a great friend, one of the most generous humans I ever met, and a really brilliant guy. By having me, when I got out to Stanford, reconnect with the acoustics of music in order to be able to make computers make musical sounds. And those are early days. We really were just working with digital to analog converters, and we really didn't have all the equipment that you have had today. So in order to really understand what you were doing, you had to really reinvest yourself in the study of the acoustics of music, the sound of music, the sound of instruments, formant regions, frequency, amplitude, duration, location. All these parameters had to be rethought through in order to do that. So for me, that was incredibly salutary. I mean, I grew up in New York City. I went to the and then the High School of Music and Art, now LaGuardia, where the great European tradition was really enforced. There was nothing else, and if you in some ways that's both wonderful and incredibly limiting. It was very helpful to sweep that aside for the moment and going back and say, well, what are we actually doing here, and what do we need to make music sound, to make sounds altogether? So that's, but the questioner, I think, is also asking about the fact that different performers will make different sounds when they realize your intentions. And I think it's up to every creator and every performer to come to some kind of conclusion about what is the extent of deviation that's reasonable given the circumstance. I mean, some pieces are intended to achieve a certain kind of deviation, and others restrict that deviation, and where the intent and meaning will be lost if the deviation is too great. So I wouldn't care to make an overly general rule about that, because I've done both of things. I've written pieces in which, precision and attention to every detail is of great significance to me, and in other ones in which I encourage variation in performance. I'll give you one example, which is not people don't think of this, but for me it's part of the Ivesian world that I respect so much, and that is my piece called My 20th Century. I don't know if anybody asked about that piece, but in that piece, the players themselves have to speak the lines of this poem. They leave their instruments and walk to the center of the stage or to the side, and then they sort of talk to each other with lines that they've memorized back and forth, and then they go back and sit down, and they do that in a kind of a square dance. And what has always struck me as important about that is that even though sometimes they need a little coaching to be a little braver about using their own human voices to say those words, because musicians, they're sometimes very self-conscious when they're not playing their instrument. They're asked to do something else. But once they get over that, I'm always delighted by the fact that some people come from Kentucky, and some people come from Canada, and some people have English as a second language. And I mean, I have a performance of that work that was done in Australia, where everybody had this wonderful, rich Australian accent. And it communicates different. It seems obvious, but it's actually very touching and beautiful when each individual renders what their task is according to your lights, but according to their own abilities and ways as well. It was performed in London by people from London with their London dialect, some guy from the Isle of Skye who had this incredible Scottish accent. And at first they came in, they were, the Brits being very sensitive to the social class of their speech. So they can get very uptight about that because they're judged very often that way. And so they all try to speak in BBC posh English. And I said, no. Please, just talk like you were talking at home. And I got this incredible variety of English, which thrilled me. And so okay, that is a case in which I open up the door and say, hey, I want that variety. But I don't say, yeah, I wrote B flat, but you can play F. No. Please play B flat.
No, that's amazing. I hadn't even thought about something like that. But yeah. And then about Ligeti, somebody wrote, I really like your description of Ligeti as a teacher and how he believed that students should learn as much as possible about everything, as much as, even if to learn everything is a little impossible. I wanted to ask, however, how important do you believe it is for composers to be original? I guess this is going back to what we were talking about earlier, but is it enough to strive to write music in a genre or style that you feel you deeply care about, or do you have a responsibility to try to push yourself?
To what? I'm sorry, what yourself?
To push yourself.
To push yourself. I'm not sure what that means, but I'll go back to Ligeti in this regard. I mean, Ligeti, is not. First of all, he's not one thing. Even though we can judge him on the basis of some of the things I said then, but over the time that I knew him, which was a pretty big expanse of time from when I first met him in 1969 when I was in Vienna, and then studied with him in '72, and then until he died in 2006. I watched him change too. I mean, he started out being completely enthralled with the European avant-garde and trying desperately to keep pace with the Boulezes and the Stockhausens and so on, and suppressing his older Hungarian music, saying, "Oh, no, no." I mean, I actually heard him say that. But then, after a certain sort of kinds of transformations during the time, he wrote his opera, The Grand Macabre, and then the death of his mother. So by 1982, he was kind of also reconnecting with a certain kind of music that he had not acknowledged really before, and the whole late Ligeti music is quite different than not quite different. It's the same figure, the same character, but there were certainly times when talking to Ligeti, if you didn't know something that he thought it was important to know, you should go and look at that. You should know that. He was impatient with students who were constantly, as he would have put it, discovering the moon. Looking out the window, saying, "Oh, wow, there's a moon. You should know by now there's a moon." On the other hand, he was very impatient with anybody who tried to write like him. He was not interested in that at all. And on the other hand, he also was not interested in people whose, if you were going to not write, for example, I remember one of the harshest things I ever heard him say to a student in a seminar was, that is not very interesting. We have found this music was on the floor of scraps we found on the floor at Darmstadt. This is not interesting. And that was the criteria for him, is not necessarily pure novelty, but interest. So if you could make something new, that was very exciting for him. But it wasn't necessarily novelty for novelty's sake. Although surely for a certain amount of time, when he came as an immigrant from Hungary to Europe, he was very concerned to be considered as one of the leading original figures in European music at the time. That changed, and I think he arrived at a more satisfactory position for himself, which allowed him to reinvestigate whatever it meant to him to be from that Hungarian part of the world. I mean, if you don't mind, I'll just go one little further about Ligeti in this regard. One of the you can read books about Ligeti. Now the new ones are better than the older ones, but there was a period in which people accepted without question Ligeti's own self-evaluation as a kind of the leading avant-gardist of all avant-gardists, and then that kind of died back. But what is not as clearly understood is that there is a little folk song that you hear in his Six Bagatelles for wind instruments, which actually occurred even earlier than that in the Musica Ricercata for piano, and even earlier than that. That tune is also in the piano, in the horn trio. It's also in the violin concerto. It's also in the piano concerto, and it's in the solo viola piece. And it's a Hungarian folk song. So you're looking at a kind of continuity, which he probably would be reluctant to acknowledge in some way, because it suggests, well, maybe, originality. I mean, look, that guy back there, he did sort of stuff like that, So, yeah, I guess, a person, to try to sum up a person in a single observation is not possible. But I think the exciting thing about Ligeti is with the focus on searching for non-conforming versions of what music is and could be, which for him included, non-caro, for example, and African drumming patterns. On the other hand, Roberto Sierra will tell you about things that he took from Latin American music. And then there's Ives, who he also liked very much, and he has a piece called Self-Portrait with Reich and Riley, and Chopin is auch dabei. I mean, he's a pretty omnivorous kind of guy when it comes to music, and he didn't feel he felt stylistic things like that were kind of cages. He felt trapped in them after a while. I wanted to be released from them, and that is has been very inspiring. And then of course there's the the amazing sonic imagination of that composer. It was always for me, like a beacon, like a lighthouse. Like even if I wasn't going to do what he did, at least it would light the water around the sea where the rocks were, so I didn't have to crash my boat, somewhere. I could see. I mean, he was like a vision. That was a vision of great power for me.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, what was it like to study and live in Europe as a musician back then, and also like how it is now? I know that there's a lot that's very different between there and here. I don't know,
Yeah,
just
I mean, when I went to Europe, I had a Fulbright to go to Vienna, and I actually chose Vienna because I wanted to work with Ligeti, who had lived in Vienna. It turned out that he wasn't there that year, and I had to wait to study with him when he got to Stanford a couple of years later. But Europe is not a unitary thing, and where I went to study in Vienna, there was a very peculiar and interesting Viennese culture around. Well, a lot of different people. Friedrich Cherha, who I did study with a little bit, and Gottfried von Einem, another important teacher of mine there, and the musical culture of Vienna, which is, both greatly historical and oddly provincial. It's nothing like France, but many Americans, when I was younger, were going still to study with Boulanger in Paris. I'm younger than Phil Glass by 10 years, but there was still Chowning himself went to study with Boulanger. And that was that kind of post-American, post-neoclassical American Stravinsky world that was very prominent in that day. And Vienna was nothing like that, nothing at all. So I can't. That's what my world was like then. Now I've lived in Europe. I was the Bartok professor at Szombathely in Hungary in the early 2001, 2002, and I've taught in Poland, and I've taught in England, and in Scotland, and so I have a feeling for something of what's going on there. And I lived in Berlin. I would say the Central European group, the Franco-German group, with some extent with the Italians also, are still very much involved in their own very particular version of what music is and can be. But it's been chipped away at by other peripheral elements. It's not completely the same as it was. But it's still pretty ideologically devoted to a kind of music that is a kind of what follows from Lachenmann and Fernihow and that's in Germany. And for the French, the spectralist and the post-spectralist traditions are still very profound, and they are very, their concept of the significance of individuality in that regard is not, they don't evaluate it quite as highly as we do, say, in the States, I would say. But it would be hard to generalize too much, because there are peripheral figures in Russia and Poland and in England as well, and in Iceland for all places now, where those people are not, they're going their own way, and bless their hearts, they do that. And that's one could say that's probably true of Central America, North America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Japan, China. I think the world is extremely diverse at the moment. So I'm not saying that I wouldn't necessarily say, as was said to me, as I thought in the late '60s and early '70s, well, go to Europe and do that. And it was my great fortune that there was this interesting California world that I lived in that included John Chowning and Terry Riley and Steve Reich and so on, and Harry Parch, Jim Tenney, that kind of world in California. And then there were these interesting Europeans. There's a lot. The world is so various, and it's good, sometimes good to be away from the States. And, as a young composer, you get to look back and you can see, you can reevaluate things. It was important for me, for sure.
Perhaps just one more question. I think we're almost out of time. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Parker, but I wanted to ask, could you talk a little bit about your experience with film music and how you got into composing scores for films?
Yeah, I when I was at Stanford, I had never written any music for the movies, but I always thought, a composer for me is somebody who composes music and should be in some ways as much of a crafts person as a artiste. I've never really wanted to make too much of a gradation of significance in that. There are film composers, as you know, who are spectacular composers, and they're just unbelievable. And I liked the movies. So when I got to Stanford, I put up a little 3x5 index cards on the what was then the communications department at Stanford. Said I will work for food, and I got, they didn't have composers at that point come down and talk to them in that way, and I did that. And I ended up getting to know a whole bunch of young emerging uh, filmmakers who are really fantastic. And at the same time, you have this, you probably have seen this fair housing little logo with this house in it, and there's a little equal sign because there was just a law passed by Congress that you couldn't redline people, and you couldn't, keep black folks from moving into any neighborhood they wanted to. And the government put out a series of little commercials for fair housing, and I wrote 20, I don't know how many little 30-second quips from that, using both computer that I was working with and instruments. But I really became a good friend of John Else, who is a great, great documentary filmmaker. And because he was an open-minded and brilliant guy, and he just thought, let's work together and do stuff together. So we did a couple of films, but the one that's probably two of the most important ones. One is called The Day After Trinity, about J. Robert Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb, for which we got nominated for an Academy Award. We all went to Hollywood, blah, blah, blah. And then I worked on another one called Cadillac Desert later, maybe almost 15 years later, which is about water in the West and the manipulation of water. It's actually the story of Chinatown. I don't know if you know that great Roman Polanski film called Chinatown. Well, it's about how Los Angeles stole a river and became a real city. So when I say film music, it's not that I went out and sold myself doing dramatic features. I knew the life that would entail would not suit me. I couldn't do that. I couldn't work on stuff I didn't believe in, for one thing. And I just didn't want to live the Hollywood life because I saw too many colleagues, drugged out and destroyed by the materialism and weirdness of that world in Hollywood. Not everybody can resist it because there's so much money floating around, and it was not for me. And I wanted to keep my hand in it. So I ended up, I think you can look on I have an IMDb site online. You can see I've written about 9 or 10 film scores, and I haven't done some recently because the documentary film world has kind of dried up a little bit. There's no money for it, and so you can't. It's hard to pay, to do this without money. But the people I worked with allowed me to experiment with different kinds of music and different kinds of ways of thinking about music, and it kept my skill set pretty high. I would have to help record this stuff or find people who would help me do it, and so yeah. I mean, I'm very proud of the films that I worked on. I think they're all. Another one, fairly recent one, was called The Botany of Desire, which is based on Michael Pollan's book he wrote the book on the omnivore's dilemma. It's all about food and the need for slow food and natural food and so on. So yeah, it seemed, music for me finally in the end is a social art, and it requires that I interact with people, and I want to interact with people with whom I feel congenial and feel inspired by, and it's been, I can't complain. It's it's been a good life, even when I taught at Eastman, frankly. No, I'm just kidding.
Good to hear.
Just kidding. It was Rochester is hard. I have a lot of respect for you guys. I remember, I know I have to go, but I'll just abusing, it used to be 2000, 2003. There's that coffee house that's right next to the school there, right? Uh,
Javas?
yeah, Java. Is it still there?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, well, it used to be that the people who ran the place were the meanest people that ever existed. I don't know if they're still as mean as they used to be, but if they didn't know you and you walked in there, they could call 15 people before you to get the coffee and the bagel that you were waiting for. And on a cold day walking down East Street, you really needed a cup of coffee and a bagel, and sometimes it was very frustrating to stand there and wait and not get your coffee and a bagel. But the coffee was good and the bagels were good, so it was worth it, definitely. Yeah. So if you want anything else you need from me,
I think we're all
Um,
set.
yeah,
Charles, is there anything else you wanted to add?
I don't think so. Just this was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
it's my pleasure, Parker and Charles and David. It's nice to really see you. I see us older gents really got that COVID hairdo now.
Oh yeah, I mean that's required. That's yeah,
I mean,
you have to have that.
it's just inevitable and unavoidable. Right?
Martin, it's been so great to listen to this, and thank you to the team. It was so inspiring, so excellent. Thank you.
Thank you all, gents. It's nice to see some old Eastman friends, and please give my very best to everybody I knew back there.
Certainly.
It's still a long wait for the elevator to get up, in the lobby.
Longer now.
All right, guys. It's a pleasure. We'll see ya.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.